So maybe you've seen the movie called Into the Wild. It was a book first. It was written by Jon Krakauer, a book also by the same name, Into the Wild. And I remember reading it, and it had quite an impact on me. It follows the life of this young adult named Chris. And Chris is sort of out there in the world, and he's working, and he's kind of getting into, the rat race of things, and he decides that life must be more than this. So he goes on kind of a radical change of his life, leaves everything behind, and he goes, as the book title says, into the wild. So he's in the north, I think he's in Alaska, and he leaves everything behind, and he goes into the wild in search of meaning in life. And he decides that in order to find meaning, he will kind of pursue adventure, to be alone, to be there, to be one with nature. And I don't want to give too much away from the book or movie, but things don't exactly end well with Chris. But he's able to kind of find this purpose for which he seeks. Now, we probably cannot in our life just leave everything behind like Chris did and go into the wild in search of purpose. We have lives, we have families to care for, we have jobs to do. But perhaps we can sympathize with this desire that was in Chris's heart, a desire to find purpose and meaning, to find fulfillment in the midst sometimes of routines in life that can seem dull or can seem a bit lackluster or can seem like they drain life for us. How do we find this fulfillment, this joy, this meaning in the midst of our regular lives? In the gospel today, Jesus needs to point out to his apostles in what really true joy and meaning and purpose in life is found. So in the gospel today, we're reading from Mark's gospel again. And Jesus, as we heard last gospel, was describing how he's the kind of Messiah who needs to suffer, who needs to die. And this has consequences for us as his followers. But right away we see that his followers don't quite get it. They're confused. They don't know what it means to follow Jesus. Because after Jesus has said that he, this Messiah, is a suffering one and a servant to all, now, as they're journeying along immediately after this event, Jesus comes to learn that they were arguing, and they were arguing about who is the greatest among them. So the apostles then have this very misguided notion about what it means to have fulfillment in life, or what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. They think that this is found in power, in prestige, in ruling over other people. And Jesus has to again take them aside and correct them. They say when it comes to Mark's gospel, Jesus' apostles are kind of painted quite negatively. They say that in Mark's gospel, the only good thing they did before the resurrection, that is choose to follow Jesus. After that, they always make mistakes. They always misunderstand Christ. And here's another example. Jesus has to pull them inside and say, the greatest follower of mine is not one who has power, but rather one who serves, is one who lays down their life for others. And Jesus then gives this example of welcoming a little child. And for us, this can seem a bit strange. Who wouldn't want to welcome a little child? In our culture, thankfully, children have a great pride of place. They're valued, they're treasured. At Jesus' time, this certainly was the case to a certain extent, but children were much more vulnerable than they are now. There was a very high infant mortality rate. Life was very difficult for children, and many did not live to adolescence. So their sort of value that they had wasn't quite like it is today. They were certainly some of the most vulnerable, some of the most kind of in a precarious situation at Christ's time. And Jesus says that if we want to follow him, we need to welcome, to make place for people that perhaps in society didn't seem to have this value. This is what it means to be Christ's follower. So we see then Jesus is pointing out that to be his follower, to find true fulfillment in life, we don't seek power, but rather we seek to serve. And St. John Paul II summarized this very beautifully in what he called the law of the gift, which is kind of a contradictory law that we only experience when we live it. We think, like Jesus' apostles did, that we get fulfillment in life by getting things, by getting power, prestige, but Jesus shows us another way. He indicates to us that when we give our lives to others, when we make our lives a gift for those around us through service, it is then that we find true fulfillment, true peace, true joy. Different saints, of course, have lived this law of the gift in an extraordinary way. And in particular, the example of the martyrs are people who live this law of the gift, live Jesus' commandment in the gospel today that we're called to serve, to lay down our life for others. The word martyr comes from the Greek word witness. So martyrs were always seen as kind of a wonderful example or witness to what it means to follow Jesus. Today's Sunday is an interesting one because it falls between some very important martyrs that are associated actually with churches and countries because their example was so great. So last week, just a few days ago, we celebrated the feast of the Korean martyrs who were so instrumental in starting the faith there, mostly lay people who gave witness to the faith, who showed what it meant to follow Jesus even in the midst of persecution. And next week, September 26th, we will celebrate the feast of the Canadian martyrs, St. John Brebeuf, St. Isaac Jogues, and others who were really some of the first missionaries here in our country. And of course, they came to Canada at a time of great conflict with colonialization, different European forces kind of vying for power. But the Canadian martyrs oftentimes showed a great openness to the indigenous cultures. We see, for example, in the example of St. John Brebeuf, this love for the Huron people, to learn their language, to live among them, to kind of protect them from some of the terrible things that were happening from the European settlers who were seeking power, who were seeking money, who were seeking to kind of enforce their will upon others. And St. John Brebeuf tried to protect these individuals, to lead them closer to Christ as well. St. John Brebeuf then got caught into some of the warfare that was there and suffered and died for the faith and for those Huron people that he came to serve. St. Isaac Jogues, like the other Canadian martyrs, lived this extreme example of witness, of laying down our life for others, of living this law of the gift. We are called, all of us Christians are called, to live as martyrs in some ways, to be witnesses. We are not called probably to lay down our life in this way, but we are called to serve. We are called to transform our ordinary actions into something extraordinary, to live this life of service that Christ calls us to. Oftentimes, when you listen to sort of these leadership or you read leadership books, podcasts, things like this, they discuss about successful businesses or successful organizations or sometimes people who seem to have their lives together. And what they emphasize oftentimes is that successful organizations have their why figured out very well. There's an author who has kind of a YouTube video on this. His name's Simon Sinek, and he talks about this, the power of why, the power of knowing why we do certain things. And oftentimes we can live our life, our ordinary life, our different routine, and lose sight of this why. We have our jobs that can seem kind of routine or seem to get us down, chores around the house, relationships that can seem difficult. And when we lack this why, then we lack peace, fulfillment in our lives. Jesus in the gospel today gives us the greatest why, the reason for how we can find fulfillment. When we connect why it is that we do these things, we do them for love of God. We do them for love of our family. We do these things to love and help our friends. When we do kind of seemingly simple or routine tasks, with this great why, having an idea why we do it, then we can do these things and it gives us greater hope and fulfillment. So ultimately, we cannot all, like that young man in Into the Wild, leave everything behind to find fulfillment. And oftentimes, that's not the way to go in the end. But Christ lays out a radical roadmap for us for how we find true fulfillment and joy in our lives by living this law of the gift, by living simple actions, whether it's our work, at home, relationships, with this desire to serve others, to lay down our life for them. So perhaps then in this Mass, we can kind of ask ourselves a question. What is one area in my life that seems quite difficult at this time, quite heavy? Maybe something I need to do for routine. It could be work, chores, or other tasks that I have that seem to have lost its meaning. Perhaps we could see, through the gift of the Holy Spirit, that we can endue this with some meaning. Perhaps we can remind ourselves of who we do this for, or that we do this out of love. And when we act then in this way, we experience this true fulfillment that Christ calls us to.